for the Students of Mass Media Literacy course on what sources do I use for both the content analysis and pilot study papers in this class, as well as other papers in the Journalism and Media Arts department, as well as where do I find those sources, and after I've cited them in my paper, how do I reference those sources? These are very typical questions for students when they're coming into a new discipline. And it's very, very important to cite sources correctly and to reference them correctly, not just because it's pretty in a paper, but mostly because these are the expected and necessary methods that social scientists are going to use to, at first, judge whether or not you've actually done your homework, whether you've done your research, whether you've taken time to do due diligence to the cumulative nature of science. In other words, what have other researchers found before us, and how does our research either replicate, augment, or refute that earlier research? Those are things that we'll get to later in the course. But ultimately, right now, the question is, number one, why do I cite sources? And essentially that comes down to, you're not an expert. Neither am I. Neither is any scientist unless they've done a significant amount of research into one specific area. And what that usually means is they've spent years studying it. So when we cite sources, we are essentially showing that other scientists have found specific results, and they have reported these, and we're making sure to use these as part of building a case for either the necessary replication of this study or how other research and other theory ties into what we're doing right now. Essentially, the other part of this also is to show the cumulative nature of science. In other words, because other researchers have done this before and found something, it doesn't mean that we A, either accept it, or B, simply move on from it. So we're trying to build a body of knowledge, what we would say we're building theory, and so that we can create ideas and theories and hypotheses that try to explain the world in which we live. So we cite those sources again. We find those sources to essentially add credence to our paper, but also to allow future scientists, if these papers were to be published, to allow future scientists to actually take our work and the work of previous individuals and then build on that even further. Now, lots of students also ask, why do we use a specific style within a discipline? In the Journalism and Media Arts department, we are a social science, so we tend to use the American Psychological Association, or APA style, for what we do, because we are essentially looking at not only who is the author, but how old is the research. You'll see what I mean in a little bit, but it involves the date and it involves the author's name. Within the MLA style, which is used within the humanities, it tends to be not as important of the date, more important on who was the author. Okay, so here, though, we are going to focus specifically on who's the author and when was it published, because the science changes. Ultimately this, what we're going to do is, in this class, in order to write our papers, we're going to, number one, have to find sources. Number two, we're going to have to actually secure those sources. And then number three, we've got to go ahead and decide on how do we cite those sources within our paper. Okay, so most of this is about the appropriate type of source and then citing those sources. So if you look at the screen quickly, what we're going to do here is, first I'm going to take you to Google Scholar. Google Scholar is a great place to begin looking for sources that we can actually use within our paper. And many students ask, what kinds of sources would I actually use? The key here is to use peer-reviewed sources, and those are the type of sources that have been vetted by an editorial board within a scholarly journal, such as Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly. That review board looks at the study, determines whether or not it's internally and externally valid, whether or not the results are something that are important enough to place in the journal itself, and then ultimately whether or not to actually publish this or send it back for review. Google Scholar tracks these studies and makes them available in terms of understanding where they are, where they were published. That's usually the basis of what we're going to use Google Scholar for in this class, because oftentimes the sources you find on Google Scholar, if you go directly to that source, they're going to ask you to pay for it. Because you're a student in Hastings College, you won't have to. You can get these through Perkins Library, through a number of databases. And if you can't find it on the database, you can get it through something called interlibrary loan. What I want to show you quickly is what a source like this looks like. And very quickly, these are sources that have been cited in a paper that I've actually written a while ago. And this was a paper in critical discourse analysis looking at National Geographic and how they portrayed residents of the Great Plains. You'll notice in these first two sentences here, as the sentence reads, one of the mass media outlets demonstrating long-term interest has been National Geographic. Johnston observes the magazine is the market leader of periodicals and holds an unrivaled world reputation among geographic publications. And here's the key part. In parentheses, then you'll notice that it says 2009, comma, page 348. And what that tells us is Johnston's article was published in 2009, and this specific citation can be found on page 348. Now, the key here is that you'll notice it is not a direct citation. This is what's called paraphrasing. And even though it's paraphrased, it's still not my information, and therefore I need to cite it. If you didn't think of it and you didn't actually publish it, then in papers like this you need to actually cite those sources every time. Now, you can use a different method for it, if you'll notice a little bit down below. In this sentence, it says, in its 125 years, the magazine has become a venerated public institution, the identity of which, as an enthralling window to the world, has been uncritically accepted and even celebrated by the American public. Manganaro, 1995, page 206. And this is more of the typical type of source citation that you'll find, and you'll use that fairly often in your papers as well. A third type that you'll see is here. And this is actually when we see IBID, that is simply saying I'm using the same source as I used before, but a different page number, or if you were to use the same page, you would simply have the IBID within the parentheses in italics. That's acceptable as well. So that's a general idea of how we cite these sources. If I were to show you what a source looks like, if we go to this is a source, and if we look at this, these are ones that we would find by searching Google Scholar. You'll notice that it's in Educational Psychology Review. We have a volume number, and an issue number, and a date. These types of articles are usually fairly dry. They are research. They're not page turners. They're meant for us to further the science of the moment and further the study of a specific discipline. So reading these is very key. This is what's called an abstract. And you can really learn what's in the actual study by reading the abstract. However, the abstract is no substitute for actually reading the pieces of the study itself. You, in this class, are actually writing a type of abstract. What this means, though, is that there are sections in the abstract, which first is a literature review, as you'll notice here. What we come along to then is an extensive literature review. Many studies then after this literature review we'll come into, instead of using something along this theory line, we will come through and then instead of problem-solving support, you'll have something such as research question, hypothesis, and method. And then at the end, it will come down to discussion. In this class, we call them conclusions, and you don't actually go through and give your conclusions with these headings. What you'll do is simply begin your conclusion by saying, in this study I have found, or in this study we found. Okay? But that's what a peer-reviewed study looks like, and at the end you will notice a significant number of resources. And what this means is these researchers have gone through this and found significant resources for them to cite as well. So this is, again, that cumulative nature of science. This is in American Psychological Association style. And you'll even notice the way that these are cited here, okay, is in that same style as well. So, as mind-numbing as that may be, it is important that you understand that this is why we use this type of citation. Okay? Ultimately then, once you've decided on a topic, you then go to Google Scholar and start finding sources. So in this case, let's assume that I'm interested in how people learn from television. Okay, I can simply type in how we learn from watching television. And this is a good place to start. So I have digital literacy, I have learning from museums, what we can learn from time use data, and it means that I'm going to have to begin reading some of these things. Now, I'll tell you right now, one of the things that we can say about learning from watching television, you can begin looking at social cognitive theory. Okay? And what this means is how we learn from each other, and ultimately you can also say a subtext of this would be social learning theory. Okay? These are ways that we can begin talking about how we learn from watching others, how we learn from watching television. So let's say, for instance, that I really like this study. Let's go to social learning theory of aggression. Okay? Now, I'm not going to be able to get this study. You'll notice that it's in the Journal of Communication, Volume 28, Issue 3. And it's from September 1978. Now, I'm not going to be able to get this without paying for it. But what I can do, instead of paying for it on Google, all I need to do is highlight the name of the article, copy it, and then I'm going to go over to Academic Search Premier. This is EBSCO Host Web. And you can find this, by the way, before I go and do this, by going to the Perkins Library page and going to the Alphabetical Databases section. And there you can find it under Academic Search Premier. Now, I've also on Bronco Board put a link for you on this, but after this semester, when you may not be able to access that anymore, Academic Search Premier is the place to go. So, I want to go ahead and I'm going to select all the databases, and I'm going to begin. If I go to Basic Search and paste the article, I'm going to go ahead and just search, and let's see if I can find it. Okay, and it may not actually be there. I don't see that. So if we now go back and we're going to add Bandura to this, and you're not actually going to be able to find it. These are all probably studies that have been that have cited that initial study. So what we have to do, and this is what research involves, is I'm going to go back. I couldn't find this one, so I'm going to modify my search a little bit. this is in the Annual Review of Psychology. So now, let's assume that this is one that I want. I'm going to copy the title again, go back into my search, paste it, and look what I have. I've found it. There is a PDF full text here, and I can go ahead and I can either look at it online, or by right-clicking, I can download the linked file. Okay, and in this case, it's going to just let me view the article. But I can go up to here to download the PDF as well. So you can save these and go through and read them. You'll notice there's contents, there's an abstract, everything we've talked about before. So you've found your article, right? Now the question is, what do I do with it? And in this case, what you're doing is you're using the article as background support to say, this is why I studied this. These are the pieces of this phenomenon that I'm trying to look at. So one of the things we use social cognitive theory for a lot is the study of how young women learn from media what type of body type they should have. And social cognitive theory is very important in this. So if I were writing about anorexia or bulimia and how the media perpetuates that phenomenon, I would start with social cognitive theory. That will then help me structure my own study for the content analysis that I would then do. Okay, that's all fine and dandy, right? But in the end then, you have to cite these sources, as I've showed you in the text. So again, if you go back and look at the paper, okay, these have been cited. Okay, that doesn't help as much. I'm going to close this quickly. So here are my citations again. So for instance, Manginaro. And then if I go all the way to the bottom, close your eyes as we zoom past here, and you'll notice there are a significant number of sources here. Okay, these are cited in APA style, and what's important then is students often ask, how in the world do I cite in APA style? And it's very critical that you do this correctly. It's not plagiarism if it's wrong, or if it's incorrect in its citation. However, it is, on my papers, a drop of 10% in the overall grade of the paper. It's very, very important that you learn these habits immediately when you're in college. So I tend to be very, very picky about APA style so that you learn these habits right away. Now, again, if you're worried about not knowing how to cite these, I've also posted a link on Bronco Board to the Purdue Owls APA style page. This is really the definitive site online, other than the American Psychological Association itself, but this is the definitive site for how to actually cite your sources. So if you go to the workshop, this is a nice overview of why we cite, how do we have proper APA style within a paper, and why do we use it. Ultimately, though, you're going to use oftentimes the APA guideline itself. And you'll notice down here it has all the different reference styles that you're going to need, both in text, okay, and how to use authors. Also footnotes and endnotes. We use endnotes in this class. That's that references list that I showed you before. So that's essentially APA style. The key here is that you are always in text going to make sure that you cite an author, a year of publishing, and a page number that you found it. Okay? In the reference list itself, you're going to make sure that that is in proper APA style. And the reason for providing the reference list is because we actually go back as social scientists and find these sources. This is a great beginning as a researcher to find other possible sources for our studies. That's a hint for you as well. When you go find these papers, if you're not getting what you really want out of one peer-reviewed study, you can go find other related peer-reviewed studies by looking at the reference list of those articles. One last thing, it's very important that you understand that things like the New York Times, things like Newsweek or Time Magazine, those are not acceptable resources for a paper such as this. The only types of resources you are allowed to use for these two papers, again, are the peer-reviewed sources. That doesn't mean, and that means for your literature review, when you actually do your content analysis, you're going to use media itself. That's not a resource. What that's referred to as is your data. Okay, so data is not are not your references. Okay, I hope that helps. Again, what we've looked at today is what sources do I use for the papers in mass media literacy? Where do I find them? What are some examples of citations? And then ultimately, how do I cite my references? If you've got more questions, please feel free to drop by my office and also or drop me an email, and I'm happy to help. As you know, I'm in my office quite a bit and or around the Gray Center. So please feel free to come and ask questions. I'd rather you ask questions than just try and wing it. And I hope you have a great day.